you a better idea about how to evaluate these two criteria when you're looking at the 10-point assessment, okay? And next time we'll talk about the market. But today we're going to talk about evaluating early stage inventions. The focus is on the invention, not on the market, okay? So the question we're trying to answer is, should we patent this? Okay, somebody walks into the TT office, Sampath brings in a description of his going upstairs device, and you have to decide whether you're going to patent it or not. And Geet walks in with his hybrid electric vehicle cooling system, and 6 other people walk in with other inventions, and you can do 3. You can't do 8, you can do 3. So which ones do you choose? So this is a way to help you assess the invention that's just been presented in front of you and think about whether you patent it or not. Okay, so we're going to talk all about all the things that make it patentable, this one, and maybe valuable. And then I'll just spend one slide. I'll just talk about these things very quickly. Okay, but the most of it is going to be about patentability, what it has to be in order to get a patent granted. And if it's valuable, how can you make it more valuable so that if somebody could be prevented from making, using, or selling this invention, they would want to buy it from you? What makes it something that somebody wants to buy? Okay, so we're going to talk about patentability and value a little bit. And then these 3 things just on one slide. Okay, and it's all about the patent, the intellectual property. In this case, because we're in university setting, okay, it's usually patents when we're talking about scientific inventions. You know there are other forms of intellectual property, but we're talking about patents today. Okay, so should we patent this? So you saw this slide last time, but last time I told you I would talk about it this time. I just showed it to you very quickly, and I said I would talk about the details of this last time. Last time I told you I would talk about the details today. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. How do you get a patent? It has to be these 3 things. It has to be patentable subject matter. Some things are excluded, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. It has to meet these hurdles. These are the 3 key criteria that the patent has to be, otherwise you won't get to the starting point. It has to be novel. It has to be inventive, and inventive, and it has to have commercial utility or applicability. You must be able to apply it in a commercial setting. And the third thing is you have to provide in your patent specification a complete, full description of the best way of practicing the invention, which involves showing how does it work, how can you use it, how does it solve a problem that people value, and examples that show that it does work. So this is what you have to do in order to have a chance of getting a patent. Okay, patentable subject matter, meet these hurdles, describe it fully in your patent specification. So patentable subject matter, what's that? Well, most attorneys will tell you that most things are patentable. It's not completely true because there are some exclusions, which are on the next slide. And some things are not patentable inventions. It has to be an invention. So if it can be industrially applied, it has a chance of being an invention. To be patentable, it has to meet those criteria I just told you about: novel, inventive, and commercially useful. It cannot just be a mere discovery. If you just pick something off the ground and discover it and nobody else has seen it before, that doesn't make it an invention. And some things which are patentable subject matter are processes, manufacturing processes, like a new way to make a widget. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, out comes widget. Do steps 1, 2, 3, 4 a million times, out comes widget, always the same, exactly the same widget a million times. A manufacturing, standardized manufacturing process that delivers the same thing every time you do it. That's patentable. Machines, actual machines, physical machines, like, for example, your not to be called a wheelchair, your mobility device. You could call that a kind of machine. You could also call your cooling system, you could sort of call it a machine. It's probably more of a device rather than a machine, but it certainly has some mechanical features, doesn't it? They both have mechanical features. Yes? Yes. Okay. A little bit of interaction, so I know you can hear me. Okay. Okay. Compositions of matter, not your field, okay, but in the biological field, chemical field, new drugs, compositions of matter, obviously patentable. That's what you take when you take a drug from the pharmacy. Okay, it's probably patented, or it used to be. Software, in some countries, software is patentable. Not everywhere, but some places. So new technologies can be easily incorporated because the way the patentable subject matter is described is very broad. So in the last 40 years, there's a lot of biotech inventions. Whereas in 1950, there were no biotech inventions. The patent law didn't change. It just was readily able to accommodate new kinds of technologies, new kinds of fields of scientific endeavor because of the way it's drafted. So it's pretty easy to add new kinds of technologies. Your kinds of technologies are not particularly new. Rolling devices for carrying things are not new. Yours have special features that allow it to go up and downstairs more easily. But that's not a new field. That's kind of a mechanical field that exists already. Hybrid electric vehicles, the hybrid electric part of it is new. Not anymore, but it was new a while ago. And your cooling system hopefully is new, because if it's not, it won't be patentable. So some things about your technology might be considered new, but mostly your technologies are the kinds of things that the patent system has been designed to protect for a long time. Now, some things cannot be the subject of patents. Laws of nature. I think I told you last time, Einstein's equation, famous equation everybody knows, E equals mc squared. That's a law of nature about the conservation of mass and energy. It's not something that the patent office in the United States or Germany or Sri Lanka or Thailand or anywhere is going to say a company can have a monopoly on this and stop other people from using that equation. And that doesn't make sense. From a public policy point of view, no government is going to say that particular companies only can use laws of nature and nobody else can. So that's not patentable subject matter. Abstract ideas are not, natural phenomena are not. And in some countries, jurisdictions, you can also not have patents to plant varieties. There's a different kind of intellectual property that allows that, a plant varieties protection certificate, it's called in the US, or a plant breeder's right, it's called in most other countries. So there's a way to protect the new varieties, but they can't be patented. And essentially biological processes, like a process of digestion, for example, you can't patent that. Everybody's got a process for digestion in their bodies. It can't be owned by somebody. And methods of treatment, surgical treatment of patients in hospitals, you can't patent that, because the government is not going to say to a company, you can stop that surgeon from performing life-threatening surgery on a patient whose life is threatened in order to save them. You can stop them from doing that. You can say to the doctor, hey, you can't do that surgery and save that patient until you get a license from me. No, governments don't allow that. Companies can't stop surgeons from saving people's lives. That wouldn't make sense. Okay, is that clear? Some things are just not patentable subject matter, but most things are. Understandable? Okay?
Yeah.
Everybody? Okay. So now what are the rules? That's patentable subject matter. Let's suppose that your inventions meet that criterion, which yours do. Both of your inventions are patentable. The government is not going to say, no, you can't patent a moving device for going upstairs and carrying heavy things. They're not going to say that. It's definitely patentable subject matter, and so is the electric vehicle cooling system. So you've passed that hurdle. Now you have to get through the other three hurdles: novel, inventive, and commercially applicable. So what is novel? I think you might know, or have some idea what novel is. It does not mean it's just clever and intuitive and something else that somebody hasn't thought about before. It might mean somebody hasn't thought about it before. No, it doesn't even mean that. It means it's not published. Novel means it's not published in the public domain, in the prior art, in any form, anywhere. Okay, so if you've got an invention which is in the blue circle, and everything else in the world that's known about this area of technology is inside the red circle, then do you think your invention is novel? Nod or shake your head. Who thinks it's novel? Raise your hand if you think it's novel. This is your invention here in the blue circle. Do you think it's novel?
You have to check the fire.
Yes or no? Amali, yes or no?
Basically,
yes.
Depend on the fire. Whether
yes.
it's available or not.
That's right. It's unanticipated. It's over there. Everything else in the world that's known about this area is over here. You've got an ocean in between. There's absolutely no overlap between what they've done, everybody knows about, and what you've done. It's completely unknown, not anticipated by anybody, brand new, novel, not published anywhere. So it's novel, okay? Please nod if you understand. Keith, what don't you understand?
Yes. Like, do you want me to explain?
No, I want you to tell me if you don't understand.
I understand. Yes.
Okay, so if I ask you, please nod if you understand, then please nod. Otherwise, I don't know if you understand or not.
Okay.
Okay, okay. So this is novel. What about this one? If yours is the blue invention and the rest of the world knows everything inside the red circle, do you think yours is novel?
No.
Imoksha, no. Sampath? No.
Maybe.
Maybe? No. There's no maybe. This is completely anticipated, okay? Or maybe I could have put the red a bit closer to the blue. It's not novel. It's the same as all the other stuff that's known inside the red circle is also inside your blue circle. It's all known. Okay, so this is anticipated. It's already in the prior art, so it's not novel. So to be novel, it has to be not in the prior art. This is the prior art and this is yours. Not inside there. If I put a blue circle in there, it's inside the prior art. It's not novel. Okay? Now, you can assess the prior art. You can look it up and you can find it and you can read it and you can say, okay, this doesn't say anything about my invention. It's way over here and mine's here. That's excellent. But what about if you told your mother over the back fence or you published it in a journal article, which has been submitted and it's about to be published tomorrow, or you spoke at it at a seminar that you went to last week? These are all ways that you can destroy the novelty. If you talk about it or publish it anywhere to anybody who is not your university, then you have made a public disclosure. And you must not do that before you file. If you do that before you file, it becomes prior art, prior to your filing date. That's what prior means. The bottom line is you must file first before you publish. So publication means any scientific article, any oral seminar, doesn't have to be in writing. A poster is in writing. An abstract submitted for a poster that you're going to deliver in 6 months' time, that abstract, that's prior art. Seminars to which you invite other people who are not part of the University of Moratuwa. Is that how you say it? Your university. Anybody else who's not part of your university, if you invite them and you talk to them and you tell them about your invention, that's a prior disclosure. So you're not to do that. Any oral disclosure, doesn't matter to whom, when. If it's before you filed your application date, then you are in danger of destroying the novelty of your invention because you have put it in the prior art. It's now overlapping because it's there already. Instead of being way over here, and yours is here, unknown, you've told everybody, so now it completely overlaps with what's in the prior art because you've put it in the prior art all by yourself. So don't do that. If you've got something you think is very valuable, always talk to your TT office first and consider filing first and file before you publish any kind of publication. Okay, so that's the easy part. Novelty is relatively easy. Does anybody have any question about novelty? No? Okay, the next one is inventiveness. So inventiveness is determined by the extent to which those two things overlap. To be inventive, it really should be something nobody's done before. But you make a new invention, it's novel, it's not in the prior art, it's inventive because you've just invented it and nobody else invented it before you. Okay, but some parts of it might be in the prior art, but you might still have done a bit that makes it inventive, better than, solves a problem. So the extent to overlap determines whether it's inventive or not. This one's more tricky because obviously there's a difference in degree between where that red line overlaps with where that blue line is. I could make the red line there, okay? All your red line circle might be over there. So then the extent of overlap is just a little bit in there. Or I could make it all the way over here so that it's nearly all overlapping except a little crescent here. That's less likely to be inventive because there's only a little bit here that's different. If I move this red all the way over there and there's only a little bit of overlap, it's more likely to be inventive. Is that clear? Okay, so the extent of overlap with all of the stuff in the prior art, remember, your invention is one of them and the prior art is the other one. I've forgotten which one I said now. The red one is the prior art and the blue one is your invention. So the extent to which you are overlapping with that red makes it also not novel, but it also makes it less likely to be inventive. So the test for inventiveness is this question. Is it plainly obvious to a person skilled in the art, someone who knows this area of science, without the benefit of hindsight, so as of today, as of right now, is it plainly obvious to a person skilled in the art to arrive at what you said you've claimed? From everything that they already know in the world about that area of art, science, is what you've done plainly obvious? Oh yes, I could have thought of that. That's obvious, right? Obvious is something we have a general feeling about. We kind of know what obvious means. Inventiveness is harder to think about, but inventive and obvious are the same thing. To be inventive, it has to be not obvious. And in fact, in the US law, they call it non-obviousness. In other countries, they call it inventiveness. So it's the same thing. So if a fellow scientist that knows your field looks at what you've done, some part, and says, oh, it's really obvious to make those changes in that platform so that it moves up and stays steady. I could have thought of that. That's obvious. I just had to look at this and this, and I would have come up with that invention. Well, he didn't come up with that invention, did he? You did. So then you have and the same with Geek, with your invention, you have to be able to argue that the combination of things that you've done is not obvious because a lot of what you've got is already there, right? There are already fans, there are already microcircuitries, there's already filters to remove dust. All the pieces exist, right? Geet?
Yes, Mr.
Yeah, but you've put them together in a certain way, in a certain context, for a certain purpose, which does not exist so far. As far as I know, it doesn't exist. You told me it doesn't exist.
Yes.
So you have to argue that that combination of those things outside of the actual battery, because that's a feature of your invention, is inventive. It's not obvious to do that. That's what you have to argue if you want to patent this and win on this parameter. You have to be able to argue that it's not obvious, okay? If it is plainly obvious to somebody else who knows about your area of hybrid electric vehicle cooling systems to do what you did, then it's not an invention. It has to be not obvious. And when examiners and patent officers address this particular question, they can look at lots of documents in the prior art. They can look at seminars and published literature and patent specifications and abstracts from posters from all over the place. And they can put them all together and say, fans were known there, and circuitry to make it adjust the temperature was known there because it was done in that context. It wasn't a hybrid electrical vehicle cooling system, but it exists in that context. And over here we have filters to remove dust. So anybody who wanted to make a better cooling system for a hybrid electric vehicle could put all these things together and come up with your invention. So it's not inventive because it's obvious. That's what examiners can do. They can put lots of documents together and argue that it's not inventive because the combination makes it obvious. And you have to argue that they're wrong. Yes, Amali.
Sherry, that same happened for us once, because there are some inventions. Actually, it's a new product, but it is basically produced by different parts, but those are available in different kind of inventions. And the same argument from the examiner, even this will be a new product, it will be already available. In that case, how can we argue regarding that case?
So I don't know the details of your case, Amali.
Yeah, for an example, just think it's a product which combine, it's a drone product. That drone has a different kinds of parts, and each of these kinds, just like I have an cameras and springs, and there are different parts are there. But most of the parts are already identified. For an example, the cameras are there, the web system is already there, and the controllers are there. But the function that they are plan to do is different. Even the existing technology is there, the product is make something new. But the examiner is arguing that even it is a new one, but it is basically only by combining the available parts and produce a new product, can't be a novel.
So you have to find a way to argue that it's not obvious to combine them.
So basically, in that case, what is the best way? We have to argue based on the inventiveness, no?
No, this is the inventiveness. If the examiner is saying it's not inventive, you have to argue why it is. So the way to argue that it is, you have to find a way to tell the examiner that it was not obvious. That the inventor came up with this idea to put these things together for this purpose. Nobody else came up with that idea. It doesn't exist already. And people that are in that field of making whatever it's making, the product, whatever it is, haven't found it, haven't done it. And it's not obvious that when you put these three things together, you will get that and it will work and succeed. You have to make that case. I don't know how you can make that case because I don't know the detail. You have to look at the documents that the examiner is citing and look at the arguments the examiner is making and look at what you did and make the case that it was not obvious. In spite of whatever these documents say, you have to make the case that for some reason, maybe these documents are from different fields and somebody working on this product would not read that literature. So that it wouldn't be obvious to that person to combine that with that because they wouldn't know about this one. That's a possibility. Or just that is in a different context. It's not obvious to take that feature out of that context and put it in this context. You have to find a way to argue that it's not obvious. And sometimes it's very hard. And sometimes you don't win. But you have to try and make it. The invention has to be an invention. And it's pretty, I mean, it's the same word, right? If it's not inventive, it can't be an invention. So somehow you have to describe to the examiner that you have actually made an invention that nobody else has made before, and that it wasn't obvious to make it based on what everybody knew before. Usually the first argument is, well, nobody's done it yet. So obviously it wasn't obvious. If it was obvious, somebody else would have done it. That's one thing you can say, but that by itself won't be enough because you have to look at the pieces because the examiner will say, okay, they haven't done it yet, but these things are all in the prior art, in these different documents. And if I put them together, I come up with your invention. So it's obvious. And you have to say, no, it's not obvious to a person skilled in the art to look at all of those three and combine them for whatever reason. You have to find reasons why it's not obvious. It's a lot easier in mechanical spheres, such as these inventions, because they've been around a long time. In biotech, it's very unpredictable and very difficult, but we don't need to talk about that because your inventions are not biotech inventions. So it still can sometimes be quite hard, right, to show inventiveness, especially if the change you've made is only very tiny. It's only an incremental improvement. It's very hard to argue inventiveness. You really need to have made a bit of a step up over what exists already. And I think for some part, it should be able to be argued that it's inventive if the prior art has a lot of difficulty going up and down stairs, and you've made something that is relatively easy to go up and down stairs and stay stable, and it's comfortable for somebody sitting on it and carries lots of heavy weights of boxes, and it's easy to maneuver up and down stairs, and that doesn't exist. Should be quite straightforward to say that it's inventive. With the hybrid electrical vehicle cooling system, I think you might have a little bit more difficulty because all of those pieces exist already. So you have to find a way to argue that the combination and having it external, we'll talk about this a bit more in a little while, external to whatever, you call it external as opposed to internal in the motor, in the electric mechanism, that makes it inventive.
But,
it might make it easier to get in and out, but you have
yes.
to argue that it's not obvious.
Yes, Mr. There's a difference, like when it comes to normal cooling systems, it doesn't have a thermoelectric cooling devices in it.
That's good.
That thermoelectric cooling we have used in it because it is suitable for tropical weather conditions. So they haven't
Yes, I understand.
designed it for like tropical weather conditions. So
yeah,
we are trying to address that problem. So it has there is no thermoelectric cooling involved in that cooling systems.
No, but as I said, examiners can use things in the prior art and put them together. So there is such a thing as a thermoelectric cooling device.
Yes, yes.
It already exists.
Yes, not
and
in
fans,
this.
No, not in that context, but that's exactly my point.
Yes.
The examiner will look at a document that talks about thermoelectric cooling devices, and he'll look at a document that talks about fans, and there'll be another document that talks about removing dust particles. And he'll say, there's a problem in a hybrid electric vehicle in that they overheat, especially in the tropics. You want to keep it cool. So it's obvious to stop dust getting into it and to cool it with a fan and put a thermoelectric cooling device into it. That's what he'll say. And you have to argue that he's wrong. You have to argue that it's not obvious to take this thermoelectric cooling device and put it into your device for cooling an electric motor in a hybrid electric vehicle. Because maybe those devices were only used in things that have to do with submarines. I don't know, something completely different, right? So the person skilled in the art of making something to keep batteries cool is not reading literature about all this other stuff. So they don't know. So they wouldn't have thought about it. So it's not obvious. This is what you have to argue, okay? If you file a patent and you get to an examiner and he says it's obvious because this and this and this piece of literature, you have to be able to argue why he's wrong. Understand?
Yes. What if we increase the performance by a software-wise, we are making the software more efficient in the device? What will happen?
Anything that you're doing with your device that gives it advantages over the prior art helps make the case that it's inventive.
Okay.
So if it keeps it at a stable temperature, which the prior art doesn't, If it's able to adjust that, given the tropical conditions, the prior art doesn't do that. It keeps the dust out because you've included this filter, which the prior art doesn't have. All of these things you can argue were not obvious to do and make it better than anything that's in the prior art. But the examiner might still say, but it's obvious to use a filter to keep out dust particles. What else would you use? Right? So you have to be able to make the case that this combination is not just novel meaning it didn't exist before anywhere, but it's also inventive. Significantly better, a step up, not overlapping circles, out there a little bit with new stuff and different and things that people haven't thought about before to make it a step up from what else was available, and that it wasn't obvious to do that. Okay? It's not always easy. In fact, it's always the most difficult thing. Most inventions are commercially applicable. By the time you get a patent and it's in front of an examiner, you almost always get a tick yes. All the claims are commercially applicable. You'll get some of these are novel and some are not, and you'll get all of them are not inventive. That's a very common first examiner's report on any invention. Sometimes quite hard to overcome the inventiveness arguments, but you have to do that or you won't get it through. Okay, so the next one is commercial utility. In an environment, in an academic environment, it's often the case that people don't think about this because they're doing research and they're finding new things and publishing it, but they're not necessarily thinking about making it into something that could be applied in commerce. To do this kind of research, it's applied research. Applied research. It has to be able to be applied in a commercial setting to have commercial utility. And it can't just be a discovery. Okay, you can't just say, look, I just found this. I want a patent for this. And underlying biological mechanisms, less important for you, but most of the people I'm talking to are biologists. And they're really fascinated by figuring out how some things work in the body. How does this work? That's not an invention, that's a discovery. That's elucidating a principle of a natural phenomenon that goes on in your body. It's not an invention. You have to be able to apply that in some way that maybe solves cancer or kills COVID. Something other than just understanding how something works. And then for commercial utility, you have to describe the best mode. So you need it to be validated. As many examples, as many diagrams as you can possibly provide to show that it works. If you do this and build it this way, it will work every time. If you build this cooling system, you can put it into any vehicle. Simply attach it by plugging it in here. Right? You have to be able to show how it works, and it has to work every time. Again, for human stuff, you need to have human data, but that's less relevant for you. Okay, so those are the three things. It has to be novel. Some things are excluded. So some things are not patentable. It has to be novel, okay, not like this. It has to be separated like this. It has to be inventive, not too much overlap, or you're going to be not have anything that's an invention. And then it has to have commercial utility, right? Those are the three things, and you have to describe it in your specification. So what do you get? You get the right to stop others from practicing the invention and the claims for 20 years in return for disclosing it, right? You have to write it up in a patent and that gets published. That's the deal with the government. You tell the world how to do it and you get the right to stop them until somebody wants to do it and they come and ask you, can I have a license? And you say, yes, please, but give me $10 million. Okay, that's the deal. You tell people how to do it so that they know, so that they can invent around it. That's the whole purpose of the patent system, is to promote inventiveness, to cause people to be more innovative. So every time something new is described and claimed, you have to tell the world so that they can say, oh, okay, that's cool, but I can do this now, that will make it even better. It's a way to make incremental improvements on every kind of technology. That's what the idea is behind the patent system. But if you get a patent, you can stop other people doing your invention for 20 years unless they seek a license from you. And that might be valuable. But, and now we're going to talk about the value part. So that's the patentability part. But you don't want to do that and spend all that money if it's not very valuable. How do you make it valuable? in lots of ways. But the first way is that you have to be committed to doing the research. So we talked about this last time. I showed you this slide last time. The value is proportional to the claim scope. Remember, I talked about the patent document and how you write it. And at the end are a lot of sentences, one sentence each, which describe the claims. And those claims are what you would get examined with the examiner. And the examiner tells you the extent of claim that you can have. The broader the claim area that you can stop people treading on, the more valuable. If you can only stop people treading on this much, it'll be easy for them to find a way to not tread on that much, right? Lots of ways around it, right? So the value is proportional to the scope that you get in the claims at the end of the document. And that claim scope after examination in each country's patent office depends on you showing the examiner that you were in possession of the invention at the filing date. Now, as you saw last time, the examination process, I showed you that big arrow from the beginning to the examination can be 5 years. It's a long time. So the examiner is looking at your invention in 2027. And he knows all of the stuff that's been developed between 2021 and 2027. And he has to think back to 2021 and think about what was the state of the art then, and only look at literature that was published before your priority date, and not think about all the things that he's learned in the meantime. And you have to convince him that at that date, when you filed in 2021, you were in possession of the invention. You had conceived it and you had figured out how to work it. And in your case, you had both made prototypes. Lots and lots of data. So you both have done very well on this because you've got prototypes already built and described. Okay, so that's what you have to convince the examiner all those years down the track, that you were in possession of the invention now. And that means having lots of supporting data and worked examples, which in your case, you both have. So this is related to risk. Value is related to risk. If you have something that's low value, then there's very high risk that it won't work. If I say it the other way around, you'll understand even better. If you've got something that's really, really, really risky, then it mightn't work and it's not going to be very valuable because you might have to just take too many risks. Okay, so those things are related like this. This is the value of your IP in the red one, and this is the risk with the blue one. At the beginning of time down here, you have very low value of your IP because you haven't done very much yet. This is before you built the prototypes, just when you just thought about it. Very low value. What you want to do over time is increase the value, and as you increase the value, the risk goes down. Of course, it's not a smooth line like this. I just made this up. It goes in fits and starts. Okay, it goes down a little bit and then it comes back up again. You increase the value, you do this and this and it works, and then you do it again and it doesn't work. You go backwards and then you have to try again. So it's more a bit like this. Okay, it's not a smooth line, but gradually the value goes up and the risk comes down as you do more experiments and get more data. And it's good to be over here somewhere where you've got a bit more value and a bit less risk, because you want to license this to somebody. So you want them to take on some of the risk, but not all of it. If you're offering something back here and the value is very low and there's a huge amount of risk, they'll say no. Why would I do that? Especially if you want $1 million, right? You have to decrease the risk by doing more to increase the value over time. And this is a good place to be. You can kind of increase the value enough that you're over here and the risk has gone down considerably. That's reduced and the value's increased. But remember, we're only now talking about one kind of risk because we're talking about the research and development that you're doing in the lab. But there's a lot of other kinds of risk. So the R&D risk is what we've just been discussing. But there's also manufacturability risk. So how easy is it to make your hybrid electric vehicle cooling system? If you find a licensee, how easy is it for them to make 1 million of them very quickly? Or do they have to make one at a time very laboriously? And is the cost of making 10 times the cost of making one? Or can they find a way to make 10, which is half the cost of making one? And by the time they're making 100, it's 1/10 of the cost of making one. That means you've got economies of scale, right? It's economical to make more. It's cheaper to make 100. It's not cheaper than making one, but it's not 100 times the cost of making one. It might be 10 times the cost of making one. So per unit, it's 1/10 of the cost. Understand? Understand or not?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So that manufacturability risk, the costs and the risks involved in upscaling and getting it to still work the same as you had said it would, that's a risk. Some things have to go through regulations, drugs, for example, clinical trials. You have to get it through the FDA. Lots of treatments for COVID are not through the FDA yet. They're in trials. They might not get through. That's a regulatory risk. Then it might get on the market and kill somebody. That's a marketing risk. You might put your thing on the market and it might carry a wheelchair 10 times, and then the 11th time it does it, somebody falls off the wheelchair and breaks their neck. That's going to be the end of your device. Nobody's going to want it anymore, right? You can't have something that's supposed to help people and have it kill them. So that's a marketing risk. And there are other people working in these areas. So that's a competitor risk. Then there's the legal risk that we were talking a little bit about before, about the claim scope, the likelihood that you've got a decent claim scope, the likelihood that somebody will invalidate it by finding that you talked about it before you filed your patent, right? This is legal risk. So we're mostly talking about R&D and legal risk, but remember, there's all this other risk as well. The more you do, the more you get along the development pathway towards the product, the more you're reducing that risk. So if you can go further along here over here, that's a better place to be. Even more risk down here. But in an academic setting, it's difficult to spend the amount of money that's required to create that amount of value. And some of the risks that we just talked about, like regulatory risk, some of those risks are better done by the commercial partner and not by you. If you're making a drug, you don't want the university to be doing clinical trials and getting regulatory approval. You want your licensee to be doing that. And with your kinds of inventions, you might still want some of this risk, all these other risks that I just told you about here. Some of these risks, you want the licensee to take on. You're not bearing all of it. So you're not reducing all this risk down to zero. You're licensing it in here somewhere where you've gotten rid of a lot of the risk, but there's still some of it that for them to bear. Actually, there might still be quite a lot of risk, because here we're just talking about technology risk. But there could still be quite a lot of regulatory, legal, and marketing risk. Okay? But it should be clear that the reducing risk and uncertainty gives higher value. Right? You know that. That's everybody knows. More risk, more uncertainty, low value. Less risk, more value. So the question is, how do you reduce it? And the way you reduce it is what you guys have done quite a bit of in yours already. You've got validated data. You show that it's worked. You've got examples. You've even built a prototype, at least for some parts. And I think, Pete, you also built a prototype, right?
Yes.
Yes. So you've got lots of data. It works. You've built a machine or a device, and you've shown that it has efficacy. That's fantastic. That's what you need. In this kind of technology, it's easier to get that far. It's not so easy when you're doing drug development in a university. Harder to get that far. But for you, that's really good. So you need to demonstrate that it can be useful in a commercial setting, and yours both do that. And you see that most of that, more of that is around development. It's not just pure research, right? Building a prototype is building a prototype. It's no longer so much about research in a lab. It's more about development, more about application. And that's what commercially oriented research is more focused on. Okay, and that reduces risk. So now we're going to go back to our question, because all of this reinforces the need for commitment to doing all of that. But when we're just making a decision about patenting, there are certain other things we also have to consider. You guys have been very committed and you've got all the way through this. But there are some other things to think about when you're making a patenting decision. So those are things like this. We've talked about patentability, okay? These are, can we get a patent? So is it patentable subject matter? Is it novel, inventive, and commercially useful? And does it have some value? Does it address and solve a problem that people think needs solving, and you've got something that if you could give it to somebody and they could stop everybody else from making and using it, they would want it. Okay, this is a question to be addressed to see whether there's value in pursuing a patent for what you're saying is your invention. And we've talked a little bit about scope, the scope of the claim. Are there easy ways to get around it? Is the scope so small that anybody else can read it and say, okay, that's a good idea, but I can do it this way, and then I won't infringe the claim. Right? So then it's not very commercially useful. Okay, so probably don't patent it. But you have to guess, where can you go? How big can your claim be? We'll talk about that in a minute. Because scope, infringement, and enforcement are the last few things that I want to talk about in relation to this question, should we patent this? And that's all on the next slide, just one slide. So these are other things to think about around scope and value. And you do need to make a bit of a guess. This is a cross between a guess and an estimate, okay? You can't really make a fully quantitative estimate, but you can kind of guess at what that estimate might be. That's not a real word, that's why it's in inverted commas. So you're trying to have a guess at what the eventual claim scope might be that you get, because you know the invention better than anybody else, and you know the prior art because you've looked at it. And you can see, okay, I've asked for this much, but I might only get this much because that and that. But anyway, that's enough. So you decide to pursue it. So then you've made your guesstimate about what you might get. And then you have to say, how easy is it for somebody else to do something that works around that and doesn't stand on your territory? It doesn't infringe your claim. If it's very easy, then you might not want to pursue it because it might not be very commercially valuable if it's too easy to get around it. If it's a method, okay, yours are not methods. If it was a new method for making something, you have to be able to tell if the person is using your method. If they're making a thing like a cup, right, and the method of making the cup is completely different, but the cup still looks the same when they sell it, it's very hard to know whether they use your method or the old method to make the cup. So if you can't actually discern whether people have used your method, then you want to think about whether you really want to patent it, because you have to know if people are infringing or you can't sue them. And then if you do ascertain that somebody's infringing, would you sue them? Or would your licensee sue them? Is it such a big deal that they're infringing that the licensee would lose such a lot of money that they would be not forced, but they would feel that they absolutely had to stop these people from doing it. They would have to take action to stop it, to protect their markets. Okay, so if they are, then they're likely to take action, then that's good. Your claim is broad enough. You can figure out if people are using it, if it's a method. In your case, it's building machines, so you can see them. If somebody's making it and your licensee knows that somebody else is making the same thing, and there's a big enough market for them to sell their product, and these people are now taking some of their market share, then they'll sue them for infringement. Okay, so these are some of the other things you have to think about when you're filing a patent. That feeds into the decision. So then other kinds of value, okay, this is around claim scope and creating value and making it worthwhile for the commercial partner. But there are some other kinds of value that you might want to think about before you make the decision to patent. And one of them, the first one that I always think is really very important, is the inventor has to be interested in working with Amali, in this case, Sampath and Geet. You need to be interested in working with Amali to help increase the value. If the inventors give you an invention, Amali, you get an invention disclosure, and then they say, okay, license it if you want to, bye-bye, I'm moving on to something else now, I'm not going to work on that anymore. It's pretty hard for you to then do something with it because they're not of a mind to be helpful. So you need people like you've got. You need people like Sampath and Geet who are interested, who are coming to these sessions with a mentor and learning, who are working still on their inventions to make it improved. And that's the kind of people you need. That's important. If you don't have that, you consider not filing because it's very hard. Tech transfer is hard enough without having inventors who are not helping. Okay. And then you have to think about that claims If your expectation for getting decent commercial claims is not very good, you don't think they'll be very valuable, then you consider not filing. And the other two are about the market, and we'll talk more about the market next time. So if the problem that you're solving is not, the customers don't care. You might identify a problem in the prior art. Maybe customers don't care that their hybrid electric vehicle cooling system, the battery only lasts for 3 years. They don't care because they're going to buy a new vehicle after 3 years anyway. If that's the case, then they don't care if the cooling system runs out in 3 years. They're going to sell the car and buy a different one or scrap it. So then it's not very valuable. So that the problem that's solved has to be a problem that the customer values and wants to have solved, so that the customer is willing to pay for it. And then you want lots of customers. You don't just want two. Okay, it's not enough. So these are things that you have to consider when you're thinking about the market. So if you remember the 10-point scale, the first two are about the patentability and how strong is the patent rights, and the next two are about the market and whether there was a solution to a problem and how big was that market. And that's what these two things are about, and that creates value. And in the 10-point assessment, the next two things were about the business case, the extent of that, whether the business, like upscaling, can you make $1 million for 1/10 of the cost of making 10? Right? What's the business case for doing this? Can I make money? If I can't make money by making millions of these things then and selling them, then I'm not going to do it because I'll go out of business. Okay, so these two we'll talk about more at another seminar. One thing to remember is that patents are only one kind of IP. And when you're talking about doing commercially oriented research, you are thinking about a protection strategy. The patent is not the only way. It's in the realms of scientific arts, it's probably the main way. Oops, I missed one. Where are we? This one. It's probably the main way, but you can also think about this. There's different ways to protect. The first thing you have to ask is, can it be? Right, we just looked at the criteria. The answer might be yes. It's patentable subject matter, it's novel, inventive, and commercially useful, and I've got a brilliant specification of the invention in my patent application, so it's definitely can be patented. But is it worth it? Are you solving a problem that somebody wants solved? Okay, the answer is yes. So then you start the process, and then after you have filed, you might be allowed to publish. You discuss that with your TT office. And that's the way to do commercial research. But the answer here might be no. It might still be valuable. Maybe it's not patentable, but you could keep it confidential. If you can keep it confidential and not publish it ever, it might still be valuable. And then you can disclose it to a commercial partner under confidentiality agreements. And you can license it to them to be used confidentially in their manufacturing process, perhaps, and gives them a commercial advantage, and they're willing to pay for that. But it's a trade secret. It's confidential. It's not a patent. You can still license that. Okay. But it's hard in a university because university people usually want to publish. So usually when you get to there and you say, can we keep this secret? They say, no, I'm going to publish it next week. Usually, maybe not next week, maybe next month. Okay, so it's difficult sometimes to do it this way, but sometimes there can be an incremental improvement, which is not big enough to put in a scientific journal, but it's a big enough improvement that a commercial partner might be interested in taking a license. So you can still think about that. And that's still commercial research. If you can't patent it because it's no, and you can't keep it confidential because it's no, then you publish it. At least you're preventing other people because now it's part of the prior art. Okay. So there's more than one way. Just remember, patenting is not the only way to proceed, but in the sciences and in the kinds of things you guys are doing, it's the most obvious way. So remember, to get a patent, you have to be able to provide a full description and worked examples, and it has to solve a current problem in the art in a way that the target customer will appreciate and value and eventually pay for. Now, I want to distinguish here for 1 second between value and evaluation. What we've been talking about all of this seminar is evaluating the invention. Valuation is what you do when you're trying to fix a price that you want the licensee to pay. Those are different things. So at the moment, we're here. We've got an invention disclosure We've got a filing decision. In one case, we've got a first filing. In the other case, we haven't yet. So we're in here. We're evaluating the inventions. We're thinking about the stage of development, the technical merit, whether we might be deciding to do this one instead of another one because we're ranking them and we're saying, okay, we're going to select this one. We'll work on this one. We're discussing the ways to reduce risk that we just talked about. What do the scientists need to do to help move this forward and reduce the risk? And we're determining by doing prior art searches, is it patentable? These are all evaluation at this very early stage, and that's what I've been talking about. The value that you get from it later is over here. When you do a deal, how much will they pay? When you get up to marketing and finding somebody who gives an expression of interest and says, I might be interested in taking this, then you have to think about what value, monetary value, do you put on this? How much do you expect them to pay? What is the negotiation point that you then have? And then you get a term sheet and you do a licensing deal and they pay you. That's valuation, and that's a subject for a different discussion. Okay, just so that you understand, this is where we're talking about evaluation. So next time we'll think about, okay, you've got your patent. Now what do I do? I have to find somebody who wants it. Now you two are already onto this, and we're going to talk about that any minute. We're going to move on to talking about Geet's invention because I'm nearly finished. Okay, so we'll talk more about it next time, but you guys are, I think you're already hitting wickets. Okay, you're already doing this, talking to people and finding an industry and finding a segment and finding people who might be interested in taking a license. So that's great. Okay, so the take-home messages today, not all intellectual property is patentable. You have to meet all those criteria. If it is, it doesn't mean it's valuable. Might not be. So you might not want a patent. And remember, there's lots of ways to assess what that value is. And you have to assess both during the time that people are doing the development, especially between your first time you hear about it from your inventor and maybe decide to file and the 12-month date. In that time period, which might be maybe 18 months or 2 years, continuously assess during the development all of these things before you make this decision. And you can file a first application and decide not to pursue a PCT, not to pursue it at 12 months because not enough further development has been made. Okay, and it's not published. It's not published until 18 months, remember? From last month, I told you that. So all of these factors have to feed into the patenting decision, and the market perspective is also very badly needed. Points 3 and 4 on the 10-point assessment. And that's what we'll talk about next week, because the IP must support business activities of a commercial partner. Otherwise, nobody will want to take it. Okay, so that's the end. Does anybody have any questions about what we've just been talking about just now?
Yeah, I have a question. If Geet is busy, I think we'll excuse him if he wants.